Morning, morning, morning. We are this morning going to talk about the dawn of a new era, a new period for our industry that is coming more and more into focus. For a long time, we've called ourselves the blockchain industry, and if you think about it, that was always kind of a bad name for what we were doing because nobody actually wants a blockchain, right? The car industry produces cars because people want cars, right? Not pollution. The energy industry produces energy because people want energy, not you know, electric cables. The electric cables, the pollution, they're either a way of achieving what the industry is actually supposed to be producing, or they're a byproduct, sometimes even a toxic one. Well, blockchains are kind of like that. Blockchains are really, really bad, expensive, slow, and difficult databases to use. And the only reason we use them is because what we're actually about is ownership. We're the ownership industry. We're the first industry that has given people direct ownership of things uh, because we can give people digital, cryptographically secured ownership. And that's a huge revolution. And the fact that we sort of call it the blockchain makes it more confusing to people why this industry exists and what's actually important about it. And not just to people outside of the industry, but to people inside of the industry as well, who end up building the wrong thing. For example, sometimes they'll build a better blockchain, which they think is better because it's faster or whatever, but nobody actually needs that. What they need is better ownership. And over a long period of time now, we've been seeing people recognizing that what the users actually want is ownership and starting to try and sort of chip away at blockchains, remove the importance of the blockchain, because actually the blockchains themselves have been the problem, right? Trying to build, there's all kinds of ways of describing the challenges of blockchain. One of the most famous is the blockchain trilemma, but basically the approach has been, let's make things a little bit less decentralized, a little bit less blockchainy, so that we can actually focus on being able to build better product, make better business decisions, provide you better user experiences, etc. And two examples of this stand out. One is Solana, right? Solana have basically built a system which is a pretty centralized database. They've made some sort of nods towards what would have classically be considered a blockchain by having multiple different nodes running these really big servers. But ultimately, you got big servers running a very, very big database, and this has afforded them with much greater speed and throughput than you would have achieved in other ways. And so they've sort of reduced their reliance on what would classically be called a blockchain. Another example of this is Ethereum. So Ethereum have taken what is now being called the modular approach and moved most of the activity today is now off-chain, right? And that off-chain includes rollups, which is the part that everyone talks about, but also solvers, aggregators, MEV searchers, sequencers, like just a whole massive ecosystem of off-chain actors and services that now mean that the vast majority of the transactional and user activity is off of the blockchain. And so in both of these examples, what we're seeing is the reduction of the primacy of the classic blockchain and an attempt actually to get away from blockchains. The reason that this is important is because in both of these cases, there's an attempt not to admit that this is what we're doing, right? We still say, okay, like the blockchain is super important. Solana is just a better blockchain, or Ethereum is creating, scalable multi-blockchain ecosystem. And the reason we stick to talking about the blockchain, pretending like the blockchain is so important, paying lip service to the blockchain, is because we call it the blockchain industry, and sort of the narrative is you have to have the better blockchain. The reality, and here's where I think things get interesting, the reality is that we actually are unbundling blockchains, and we're figuring out that we don't need blockchains for that many things. So before I get into the things that we don't need blockchains for, let me talk about the one thing we definitely do need a blockchain for, and that is for a decentralized ledger. So, for example, Satoshi, the person who actually invented blockchains, he never talked about blockchains, right? He spoke about Bitcoin, he spoke about the network, he spoke about the ledger, right? The ability to maintain a record, a decentralized record, an incorruptible record of assets. And basically that is what he invented blockchain for. And so Bitcoin, the most successful blockchain, is also the most pure play ledger. And that is why it's the most successful blockchain. It does what a blockchain is supposed to do, which is act as the record, right? This canonical record of assets, particularly around BTC. And over the last year and a bit, we've discovered how to start adding new kinds of assets. And over time, I think we will figure out, and one of the things that we're doing with Bitcoin OS is making it possible to basically have Bitcoin act as the pure play, perfect ledger, perfect settlement mechanism for any digital asset. Okay, so that's what we need a blockchain for. But what about all of this other stuff, right? Interoperability, scalability, high speed activity, DeFi, all of that stuff. It's not clear that we need that to happen on a blockchain at all, because there the trust assumptions are different and the feature requests are different. And so what we've started to see is a shift in the thinking of the best devs, the people who are sort of thinking, at the bleeding edge of actually, we don't need to be building on blockchains at all. And key to this has been zero knowledge proofs or ZK proofs. Because what people have realized is that you can have computation, which doesn't occur on a blockchain at all, shouldn't occur on a blockchain at all, couldn't occur on a blockchain at all, because it's potentially massive computation. Like, for example, think about Binance as an exchange, right? That is a massive service with many millions of transactions occurring, some of them extremely complicated, of many, many different kinds, right? So that's a huge amount of computation. There's no way you're going to stuff that onto a blockchain. But with ZK proofs, we now have the technology at hand where you can take extremely complicated computation and you can fold it into a ZK proof and you can publish the ZK proof. And now the ZK proof allows any observer, any user, to verify that the compute occurred as necessary. And you can go a step further than that, and you can have your assets, which, sit on a blockchain, right? That's where they're registered. You can have them interact. So, for example, you could have a centralized exchange, which is doing all of this complex, high throughput computation, but is totally non-custodial. So how would that work? Well, let's say we've got the blockchain and we've got the exchange, right? The exchange is a massive computation, which is performed, let's call it, by one big machine. But it doesn't have any assets in it because it's not a ledger. In fact, even Binance doesn't hold any assets. All of the assets are on blockchains, right? When you send your USDT to Binance, the USDT doesn't sit in Binance, it sits on Tron or on Ethereum, right? But it sits in their wallet, all right? Their private key is the private key that's signing for transactions. So let's say you have a centralized exchange built like Binance, but instead of them being custodial and instead of them controlling the private keys, every single transaction occurs by you signing the keys, right? So you sign for every single trade you want to make. Okay, so now we've got a huge amount of computation providing a centralized exchange experience, and it interacts trustlessly with the assets that you and many other people that you're trading with or trading against own on the blockchain through zero knowledge proofs, and all of that computation is verified. So now we have a different kind of paradigm, right? Instead of trying to take this exchange and really simplify it and modify it and limit the computation it can do, like Uniswap did, so that it can be put onto a blockchain, we actually just say, screw it. We keep that off the blockchain. But we make it incorruptible because we don't own anyone's funds. We can't steal people's funds. And all of the computation that we're performing has to be performed transparently and verified by the blockchain. So that is the new sort of paradigm that a lot of people are thinking about. It's called verifiable compute. And we actually have examples of this right now. So there's a few exchanges that are trying to do this. One example is Hibachi. Another one, which I'm sharing here, is ZKX, right? So ZKX is designed to feel like a centralized exchange, but to be fully non-custodial and to be interacting basically with the assets that you hold on-chain through and with you through zero-knowledge proofs. Another example of this is actually much older. So this isn't a totally new idea, but it was sort of ahead of its time when loopring came out. Loopring was actually the very, very first rollup on Ethereum. And loopring was designed basically to be a rollup which does one thing, which is act as this kind of exchange. And they, I think, because they were still in the paradigm of sort of off-chain and doing rollups, they had a pretty complicated consensus mechanism, which maybe was unnecessary. Because if you're not building another ledger, you're just sort of interacting as an exchange or some kind of other asset management system with an existing ledger, you can probably do it completely centralized. And so there's this interesting idea where we talk about decentralization as if it's the goal, but actually it's a tool. It's a tool to allow us to achieve incorruptible, borderless, uncensorable systems for assets, right? For asset management, for ownership. And we are more and more moving into a world where the best developers are realizing that actually that is what users want. So there's actually a recent example which sort of does a kabuki version of this. And that is a project called Hyperliquid, right? Which recently launched their token and got a lot of attention. Hyperliquid are a perps exchange built as a separate chain. And the reason they felt like they needed to build it as a separate chain, even though no one's seen the code, no one else can verify, basically it's a centralized system. The reason they felt that they needed to build it as a separate chain is because we, remember, are the blockchain industry. And so if you want to be a successful project, you go and you launch your own chain. The next generation of hyperledgers, I don't think they're even going to feel the slightest need to do that, because where the leading thinkers in the space are right now, and that means where everyone else is going to be in 6 months and a year and in the future, is the realization that as we move into this modular world, and what the modular world means that we can do so much of the activity off chain and basically use Bitcoin as these really, really thin platforms. The need to build out a blockchain for every single new thing that you want to do, which never really existed, isn't even going to be appealing anymore. So how does this tie into Bitcoin and the work that we're doing with Bitcoin OS? Our view is that this is where the world's going. That what we're going to see is systems that borrow the security, the decentralized security assumptions of decentralized ledgers. And they're going to do this by performing compute off-chain and proving that compute to the ledger. In fact, I'll go so far as to say that over time, the word blockchain is either going to disappear entirely or is going to basically just become shorthand for decentralized ledger. Now, there are some cases where it would make sense to create your own blockchain, but those are far more limited than we think, and probably most of most of that sort of blockchain activity is going to disappear in the future. Um, and so we'll probably start to see fewer and fewer new blockchains being launched. And then the question becomes, all right, well then which ledger do I want to be able to run my application, my rolled app, my sort of centralized but incorruptible system, my semi-centralized with redundancy system, right? Depending on sort of what the trust assumptions my particular use case uses, I'm going to be running compute and proving it to the ledger, and I'm going to be interacting with the assets on that ledger trustlessly. So which ledger am I going to choose to build on? If I'm a significant financial institution and I now want to introduce real world assets, right? I want to introduce tokenized bonds, or stablecoins, or tokenized mortgages. Or if I'm, a game developer and I want to build a game that, like World of Warcraft, is going to last for 20, 25 years. Or if I'm building the next generation of AI or social media, and I want to be able to prove my compute in a way which is going to satisfy my users and potentially regulators. Which ledger am I going to be looking to prove my compute to? Now, I'm going to have a bunch of questions, right? I'm going to ask which ledger is most efficient, right? And one way that a ledger can be efficient is it is a pure play ledger, right? It doesn't try to do things like computation, because all of the computation is migrated away from the chains. It doesn't try to have its own programming language, which means I can write in any programming language I want, but acts as a really, really great ledger. Well, we have a pure play ledger, which actually fits the bill, and that's Bitcoin. Which hasn't sort of gone down the mistaken path of trying to do too much with the blockchain. It does with the blockchain only what the blockchain was designed for. All right, so that's one question. A second question I might ask myself is which system, which ledger are my users going to trust? And there too, I think Bitcoin's a winner. It's the most trusted ledger in the world. And then another question I might ask is, where am I going to have access to the most capital? Which ledger has the most assets and capital available on it? And there also, Bitcoin far and away is the winner. And then I might ask myself, which ledger has the strongest network effect? And there, Bitcoin doesn't yet have the strongest network effect. There, I think that would probably be Ethereum, which has a lot of systems being built on it. But that's because Bitcoin hasn't really entered the game yet. And with Bitcoin OS and us are now able to verify ZK proofs and prove outside computation and verify outside computation and execute outside computation on Bitcoin, I think there again, Bitcoin is soon going to at least be an important challenger. So on 3 out of 4 categories, Bitcoin is a strong leader, and likely on the 4th category, positioned to be a strong leader as well. And it's also the chain that you probably already have your assets on, particularly if you are an institutional player. And so our sense is that what we're going to start seeing is this new paradigm playing out across all blockchains, across our entire industry, but playing out first, most aggressively, and most successfully on Bitcoin. Because Bitcoin doesn't have the overhang of a lot of the bad ideas which were sort of invented just as an excuse for blockchains, Bitcoin doesn't have the sort of technical debt of all of these other solutions that have been built out. And sort of Bitcoin, because it always was thought of as a pure play ledger and or was always expected that any scaling it does would be done off chain, is actually really primed for this. And so we're in this interesting moment where sort of we had Bitcoin, we then moved away from Bitcoin as many, many new experiments in blockchain were created. We then realized that experimenting on blockchain was probably the wrong direction to go. And now we're coming back to Bitcoin. And sort of the future of what our industry, the ownership industry, looks like is as exciting, as broad, as unwritten as a sort of was the crypto and DeFi world always claimed it is, but not in the way that we thought, not in the way that we're going to see this massive, everyone will have, everyone will have their 15 minutes of blockchain fame, everyone, launches their own blockchain, but rather that we'll start to see developers using these decentralized ledgers, and in particular Bitcoin, for the purpose that they were invented in the first place, right? Just creating the world's best borderless, uncensorable records of ownership. And so the last question I think that this raises is, well, what happens to all of these other blockchains? Do they, we've got a lot of blockchains that have quite a lot of usage, that have raised a lot of capital. Are they all going to disappear? And I don't think so. I don't think we want them to disappear, because I think it's very good that we have redundant systems out there. I do think that they provide an important, that there's going to be an important role for computation that needs to happen much more quickly and with a much more data usage than what Bitcoin is probably going to be able to provide, but that you still wouldn't want to see done on a centralized service, right? So maybe a simple exchange, you're happy to see it centralized, but a system for, social media is potentially too easy to censor if someone sort of deletes the records of some of the I don't know, tweets, and so there you'd want to see a higher degree of decentralization. Or there might be instances like DAOs where it's really, really important that there's sort of like no single nexus. Even if it's verifiable and cannot cheat, you still don't want there to be a single nexus. And so you do want to have additional consensus mechanisms outside of Bitcoin's proof of work. And blockchains can provide that. And so I think what we're going to see is we're going to see all of these systems play very important supplementary roles to Bitcoin. And because Bitcoin's going to be the entire financial system over time, right? It's going to be $100 trillion network. Those systems, even though they are supplemental to Bitcoin, right? They are accretive to Bitcoin. They add and basically become part of Bitcoin's overall ecosystem. They themselves can be worth trillions. So I think we've, in many ways, actually been thinking too small. We've been sort of, our industry has to a great extent been, if we're honest with ourselves, a little bit like, what is the next sort of little story narrative that I can invent to justify me creating my own blockchain so that I can justify creating my own token, when it was never necessary. The tokens actually do make a lot of sense. We do need systems to have their own incentive mechanisms, but we actually, and meme coins have really proven this, we don't need new blockchains for new tokens to be successful. And DeFi sort of proved that before. So bottom line, I think we're going to see most of the activity not occurring on blockchains in the future. This is probably going to happen quite rapidly. We're going to see most of the off-chain activity not even happening on rollups, but on very, very specific applications. People are going to build the exact application that they want and optimize the compute environment for that exact application, and it's going to get integrated into a network, which is basically the ledger, the blockchain that they're integrating with. And that most of this is going to happen sort of first on Bitcoin because it doesn't have the technical overhang that other systems have. And that is ultimately going to mean that Bitcoin is going to become the center of the crypto industry, not just in terms of like its center of gravity, but also the center of sort of integrations, technology, development activity.